Hey guys, tonight we slip beneath the surface of time, down through layers of dust ink and forgotten dreams, to uncover the most horrible prophecies no one ever took seriously. Not the ones that show up in high school textbooks, not the classics like Nostradamus or the Mayan calendar. No, these are stranger, quieter, like whispers at the edge of sleep, just loud enough to make you wonder if you really heard something, or if your mind is already starting to drift. We'll wander into back rooms of history, where predictions gathered dust, where seers were mocked, and where warnings, bone-chilling, oddly specific warnings, were simply ignored. You probably won't survive this. Just kidding. Probably. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to comment with your location and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little journey reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In a small farmhouse in Kentucky, the furniture creaks under the weight of silence. It's the 1920s, and a man lies on a couch in a trance. His wife sits nearby, pencil in hand, taking notes as he mumbles phrases in a voice not quite his own. This is Edgar Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet. He's mostly known for his health readings, speaking while unconscious about remedies and diets. But occasionally, something darker seeps in. Tonight he speaks of continents shifting, of the poles melting, of a future where New York vanishes underwater and Japan crumbles into the sea. His voice is calm, eerily detached. His words are recorded, archived, and mostly ignored. Historians still argue whether Cayce's readings were mere subconscious ramblings, coded metaphors, or deliberate theatre. But among his thousands of sessions, there's one odd line that still unsettles even skeptics. The earth will break in the Hebrides first. The Hebrides, those sleepy Scottish islands, known more for puffins than plate tectonics. But in 2020, a tremor did strike near there. Mild, just a 3.3. But weirdly timed with a minor pole shift alert from NOAA satellites. Just coincidence? Probably. Maybe. Edgar Cayce's fans call him a mystic. His critics call him a fraud. But everyone agrees he was consistent, painfully so. His apocalyptic predictions remained unchanged across decades. He saw water covering the western US, Mount Vesuvius and Mount Etna erupting together, and a strange lull before a massive event, a silence before the sky speaks. It's a poetic phrase, also vaguely terrifying. Most unsettling, though, are his maps. Cayce never drew them, but artists later visualized what he described. They show a planet with jagged new coastlines. Florida mostly gone, the Great Lakes pouring into the Gulf. But here's the thing, when people examine modern flood simulations due to ice melt, some match up eerily well. Now let's inject some levity. Cayce also once said that eating almonds daily would prevent cancer. While that's not entirely backed by science, it has turned many nervous eaters into almond enthusiasts. Picture someone munching a panic handful of almonds during a hurricane. Thanks, Edgar. Then there's the quirky stuff. In one session, Cayce mentioned that souls from Atlantis were being reincarnated in America. Yes, you heard that right. He basically claimed your neighbour might be an ancient Atlantean who now sells NFTs. If that isn't the plot of a very niche Netflix show, it should be. But back to the unsettling. One of Cayce's least known but most vivid predictions involved the year 1998 to 2012, a window he claimed would bring earth changes, rising waters, and a great awakening of consciousness. The earth changes part didn't quite happen the way he said, but the 2004 tsunami Katrina, in 2005, the 2010 Haiti quake. All happened in that window. Again, probably coincidence, probably. Now, he didn't say the world would end in 2012, though it's often lumped in with Mayan predictions. He actually foresaw a rebirth, a new cycle, where humans would discover life in the Pleiades. Scholars laugh at that, of course, but in the 2020s, NASA released documents discussing potential Earth-like planets near the Pleiades cluster. Nothing confirmed, just, whispers. And here's the kicker: Cayce once said that the next great civilization would emerge in Siberia. At the time, that sounded like a joke, but lately, with melting permafrost and ancient secrets being uncovered, Siberia's becoming the stage for bizarre climate and archaeological phenomena. Woolly mammoths resurfacing, ancient viruses waking up, TikTokers filming glowing skies. Coincidence? Again. There's a scholarly camp that insists Casey merely picked up on headlines, and fears of his day, the 1930s, were rife with end times anxiety after all. But it's the sheer specificity that gets people. The way he referenced crust displacement before science had a word for it. The way he linked spiritual awakening to geological upheaval. That's a spicy combo. Remember that weird silence before the sky speaks line? Turns out right before Krakatoa erupted in 1883, there was a reported unnatural stillness. Animals froze. Birds stopped mid-flight. The air hung heavy. Eyewitnesses described it as time holding its breath. Sound familiar? Also, let's not ignore the fact that Casey gave his readings lying down, with a tie still neatly done up. That's a level of commitment few psychics can claim. You try predicting doomsday while being stylishly semi-conscious. One of the eeriest cases tied to his predictions involves a man named David, who in 1968 built a survival compound in Arizona solely based on Casey's future flood maps. His neighbors laughed, but in 1983, a freak flood did tear through nearby valleys. His compound stood untouched, and yes, he later wrote a book, because of course he did. Quirky detail for tonight. Casey once claimed ancient Egyptians had electrical tools, but lost them due to spiritual misuse. Makes you wonder if our Wi-Fi goes out every time you complain too much. No scientific basis for that. But still, the enduring mystery isn't whether Casey was right, it's how he spoke of things so far ahead with such calm certainty. Whether he tapped into something subconscious, symbolic, or supernatural, we may never know. What's certain is this: we didn't take him seriously. And that's sort of the theme tonight, isn't it? Because as we drift forward into the next story, we leave behind the sleepy farmhouse and the soft twang of Kentucky night sounds and head toward a marble crypt where another warning waits, this time buried under centuries of incense ceremony and cryptic Latin verses. In the candlelit shadows of a Roman chamber where dust weaves slow spirals through incense-smoked air, a monk unrolls a brittle parchment with trembling fingers. The script is jagged, uneven, written in haste or in fear. It's part of a collection known today as the Prophecy of the Popes, and this section, the one he dares read only by the flickering flame, ends with an unsettling phrase: Peter the Roman, who will feed his flock in many tribulations. After which, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The end. This, the final entry of the strange document, has no date, no qualifiers, no gentle metaphors, just ruin, judgment and silence. The prophecy is commonly attributed to St. Malachy, a 12th century Irish bishop. He supposedly received a vision in Rome, 144 mottos, each representing a future pope. The mottos are brief, cryptic, and maddeningly open to interpretation. Many historians argue that the list was forged in the 1500s to boost the profile of a papal candidate at the time. And they're probably right. Probably. But here's the twist: despite its sketchy origins, the list seems eerily accurate, at least up to a point. For example, Pope John Paul II was matched with De labore solis, of the labour of the sun, a phrase linked by enthusiasts to his birth and funeral, both coinciding with solar eclipses. A stretch definitely, but a creepy one. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. Pope Benedict XVI was next, and his motto in the list was Gloria Olivae, the glory of the olive. Not a super obvious connection until you realise Benedict belonged to the Order of St. Benedict, whose symbol includes an olive branch. Again, coincidence, or perhaps one of those selectively interpreted coincidences we humans love so much. Then came Francis, but there's no numbered entry for him on the original list, only that final phrase, Peter the Roman. That's it, the last pope, the one said to watch over the church during tribulations and disasters before Rome falls. Francis, of course, was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio, not Peter, and not Roman by blood. But he did choose the name of Saint Francis of Assisi, who was famously called the Second Peter by medieval mystics. And Bergoglio is the son of Italian immigrants, making him arguably Roman in heritage. Theologians still argue whether Francis is Peter the Roman or whether the real final pope has yet to arrive. But among Catholic fringe circles, the whispers grow louder. This is the one, the last bishop of Rome, the shepherd of the final dusk. Let's take a short mental stretch here. Imagine if your job came with a literal doomsday attached to it, like, "Welcome to the team. You're our last employee before the building collapses." Not exactly motivating. Yet Pope Francis seems almost eerily suited to the role. He's been unusually focused on environmental collapse, global inequality, and church reform, urgent sweeping issues. Almost like he's trying to patch a ship he knows is sinking. Now for your quirky fact of the night, in 1622, a Jesuit scholar named René Thibault tried to calculate the exact year of the final pope using biblical math and lunar cycles. He landed on 2025. That's this year. Don't panic, or do. Just not before bedtime. Another lesser-known nugget: during renovations in the Vatican crypt in the 1930s, workers uncovered a stone engraved with the Latin phrase "Finis venit lente." The end comes slowly. No official record exists of where that stone is now. Probably buried again. Probably. The whole idea of a final pope isn't entirely unique to Malachi, by the way. Medieval mystics and Renaissance visionaries often described the papacy ending in catastrophe. One 14th century German nun, known only as Sister Gertrude, predicted that the church would end not with fire, but with silence. No bells, no voices, just empty marble halls and wind. Think about that. Not a dramatic collapse, just fading away, like a choir that stops mid-note and never resumes. And what of Rome itself? The prophecy describes its destruction after the reign of Peter the Roman. Fire from the sky, blood in the streets, the Tiber running black. Classic doom imagery. But here's something odd in 2022. A drone video captured a massive dark slick in the Tiber caused by runoff from illegal factories upstream. It wasn't blood, but it sure looked like it. And it spread for hours before anyone noticed. Historians naturally dismiss this prophecy as either clever political forgery or poetic allegory. But even skeptics admit it's strange how this idea of a final pope resurfaces every few decades, always tied to eras of upheaval. The French Revolution, the World Wars, and now climate crisis and global polarization. Here's something for your dream-fueled imagination. In 2014, a small marble slab was found near the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, the cathedral, of the Pope engraved with Lupus venit nocte. The wolf comes at night. No official Vatican statement, just a quiet removal by men in black suits. Urban legend maybe, but enough to fuel conspiracy forums for weeks. Now let's not get too bleak. Time for joke number 2. Imagine if St. Malachi had to deal with today's Pope's Peter the Roman, spends his days battling memes on Twitter and defending theology in the comments section. Not quite the fiery downfall he envisioned, but hey, even doom needs a digital upgrade. There's also the theory that the prophecy doesn't mean literal destruction. Some scholars suggest destruction of the church could mean a shift, a metaphysical end. The church as we know it dissolving into something new. Less hierarchy, more community. Less Latin Mass, more live stream. That would be fitting, wouldn't it? The old giving way to the strange, just like we're seeing everywhere else. Back in the archives, the dusty scroll sits again, in its case unread for decades. Some say it's locked away, others say the Vatican doesn't even believe in it. But it's there, whispering. And just as we start to feel the weight of marble and prophecy settle into our bones, we leave the flickering halls of Rome behind. A hush falls as we cross deserts of shadow and sand toward an eclipse that hungers. Something is waiting there, and it's not the moon you should be worried about. The eclipse comes over the desert like a closing eyelid, slow, immense and heavy with silence. In the dry heat of 19th century India, a lone astrologer stands on a rooftop, watching the sun dim behind the lunar disk. His neighbours have taken shelter. their doors bolted against old fears. But he stays, scribbling notes, whispering calculations. He's just plotted the date of the next eclipse and he's frightened. Not by the sun's disappearance, but by what the numbers suggest. His prediction doesn't make the front page. It never will. His name forgotten. But his scribbled warning, a great darkness shall fall twice in 1 year, and blood shall rise from rivers to the mouths of kings, somehow ends up catalogued in a British colonial archive, filed between meteorological logs and trade tariffs. Historians still argue whether this astrologer ever existed, or whether the warning was inserted later by an overworked clerk with a flair for the dramatic. But something strange did happen in 1878. 2 eclipses, both total, occurred that year, one in July, one in December. Unusual, but not impossible. And then came the blood. In that same year, the northern Indian monsoon failed catastrophically. Crops died, rivers dried into red sludge. Famine struck hard. British administrators committed to laissez-faire policy refused to intervene. Millions starved. Entire regions fell silent. The astrologer's warning, blood shall rise from rivers to the mouths of kings, takes on a dark irony. The famine reports reached Queen Victoria just in time for her Golden Jubilee. She dined well that night. Flash forward 120 years and the prophecy makes a quiet resurgence, this time on internet forums. People start noticing patterns. Years with double total eclipses often correspond with political collapse or natural disasters. 1918, 1940, 1982, 2010. And then with a slow inhale they look at 2027. 2 total eclipses again. One crossing the heart of Egypt, the other touching the Americas. Just noting that, not panicking yet. In one obscure Russian Orthodox monastery, a manuscript was uncovered in 1986 describing a second sun appearing during an eclipse in the year of twin shadows. It claimed that the Earth would see 2 suns briefly, and that people would speak to birds and then forget how. That last part sounds like poetry or a migraine or a really weird Tuesday. But let's not dismiss poetic madness just yet. Eclipses have always drawn prophecy like moths to flame. The Babylonians could predict them centuries ahead. The Chinese believed they signaled the death of emperors. In Mesoamerica, eclipses were treated as moments when the gods might reverse the sky. Here's your obscure fact: in 585 BCE, during a battle between the Medes and the Lydians, a total eclipse stopped a war mid-swing. The fighters dropped their swords, fell to their knees, and called a truce. This is one of the earliest historical events with a confirmed celestial timestamp. That day the sun went dark and so did human fury, at least for a little while. Let's pivot to something lightly unsettling. In 1999, a solar eclipse passed over Europe. Right afterward, hospitals in Paris reported a strange spike in fainting spells, especially among elderly patients. The cause was never medically explained. Atmospheric pressure, they guessed, or maybe just nerves. But one nurse at a Lyon clinic reported several patients murmuring the same phrase during their dizziness: "Le roi revient." The king returns. There was no king. There was no return. But if that doesn't send a little tingle down your spine, you might be made of cardboard. Now, a little levity. You ever notice how people will drive hours just to sit under a plastic welding visor and watch an eclipse for 3 minutes, but they won't go to the doctor when their foot turns purple, just saying, back to the prophecies. One of the most obscure warnings comes from the Codex Mendoza, a 16th century Aztec manuscript. Tucked between illustrations of tribute payments and flower symbols is a drawing of a black sun over a jaguar's head, with glyphs translating roughly to "when the sun loses its eye, the jaguar eats the moon, and fire rains sideways." Most scholars read this as symbolic a way to explain eclipse myths to children, but others think it described real events. In 1780, the city of Lima experienced a brief, strange shower of red ash following a partial eclipse. No volcano erupted. The sky just bled. Locals thought it was an omen. Spanish officials shrugged it off. Science offered no clear answer. Ash from a distant island, maybe. But it lingered only over Lima. Eclipses don't cause disasters, let's be clear. But the human brain links drama to darkness, and prophecies thrive in shadows. Our scholarly phrase for this section: historians still argue whether eclipse records were post-dated to match events, or whether events were moulded by human behaviour during cosmic awe. That's the twist. Maybe it's not that eclipses trigger disaster, but that we do. When people believe the sky's angry, they act accordingly. Start wars, end kings, abandon logic, or in some rare cases begin writing sleepy YouTube scripts about celestial doom. But wait, quirky fact incoming. In 2017, during the American total eclipse, hundreds of reports emerged of confused wildlife. Birds stopped singing, crickets started chirping, farm animals clustered together as if preparing for rain, and in Oregon, one herd of cows formed a perfect circle around their water trough. No one taught them that. They just knew. Eclipse rules, apparently. Another oddity. In 2006, an astronomer claimed that certain eclipses triggered spikes in seismic activity. He was largely dismissed until his model retroactively predicted the Sichuan earthquake in 2008, not caused by the eclipse, but statistically clustered near one. His name, you've probably never heard it. He gave up academia and now sells eclipse-inspired jewellery on Etsy. Life comes at you fast. Now for joke number 3, imagine ancient prophets watching an eclipse, panicking, scribbling curses, then realising it's just a passing shadow, and muttering, well, that's 300 papyrus scrolls wasted. As we drift to the edge of this section, picture this: a village gathered in silence watching the sky go black. A child cries, an old woman hums, somewhere a dog howls. Then the light returns, life resumes, but something lingers. An unease, a whisper behind the eyelids that says, next time the shadow might stay. And with that we gently turn from the sunless sky and its hungry eclipses and step now into deep northern forests where frozen soil hides another warning, older, colder, and buried beneath rings of forgotten ice. The permafrost cracks open with a sigh. It's a soft, wet sound like soup ladled onto frozen plates. Deep beneath the Siberian tundra, something ancient stirs in the mud. Not a creature, not quite, not anymore. Just spores, frozen for 30,000 years, now blinking slowly back into a world they never belonged in. It begins with a mammoth, or rather, the tusk of one half-buried discovered by a research team near Yakutsk in the early 2000s. The team unearths the massive ivory ark, but finds more than they bargained for. Within the surrounding soil, an unusual density of microbial life, alive, thriving, suspended in time. And among those microbes is a virus, harmless to humans, they say, harmless for now. This naturally is when a certain prophecy gets passed around university break rooms and quiet corners of the web. It's not medieval, not apocalyptic in tone. It's scientific, sort of. In 1972, Soviet climatologist Dmitry Kulikov published a barely read paper titled Temporal Rotations of Biothreats Under Ice-Locked Climates. In it, he proposed that permafrost might one day thaw rapidly enough to reintroduce archaic virological material with unpredictable results. The last line, thawing, is a summons. No one noticed it then. Kulikov died in obscurity, but as Arctic temperatures began to rise fast, his phrase caught fire. Thawing is a summons. That's the prophecy. No flames, no angels, just rising warmth and something blinking in the dark. Fast forward to 2016. In the Yamalo-Nenets region of Siberia, a child dies of anthrax, the first such case in decades. The cause, a reindeer corpse, long frozen in the permafrost thawed by abnormal summer heat. Spores escaped. People sickened. Authorities scrambled to contain it. The permafrost holds secrets. Bodies, yes, of animals, of humans, of soldiers, lost to frostbite and time, but also pollen, bacteria, and viruses, many of which we've never encountered, many of which may no longer have natural predators. Think of it as a microscopic Pandora's box, except instead of hope, the last thing left inside might be an ancient cold. And here comes your historical fact of the night. In 1918, as the Spanish flu tore through the world, some of the earliest victims were buried in Alaskan permafrost. Their lungs still contained viral remnants. In the 1990s, Scientists exhumed several to study the virus. They succeeded too well. The full genome was eventually reconstructed. Controversial, extremely. Necessary depends who you ask. Here's your quirky one. In 2023, a French lab revived a virus from permafrost that had been frozen for 500 years. It only infects amoebas, not humans. But the headline's zombie virus awakens. Because nothing says restful sleep like reanimated germs from the Ice Age. The permafrost is melting fast, faster than even the doomsayers expected. In some places, it's collapsing outright, what scientists call thermocast. It sounds like a Skyrim location. It's not. It's mud and methane and microbial time travel. And therein lies the true prophecy, the past, returning not as ghosts, but as biology. We once believed history stayed buried, but in the age of climate collapse, even the Ice Age has a sequel. Now, for a sprinkle of sarcasm, remember, when everyone thought the future would be flying cars and moon vacations, instead, we're all just waiting for a 20,000-year-old virus to wake up and decide it wants to party. Joke number 4. This one's cold-blooded. If you listen carefully, you can hear the permafrost whispering. You had one job. Just stay warm. Let's pivot to our scholarly debate phrase. For the night, scientists still argue whether the risk of ancient pathogens is exaggerated by media or genuinely underestimated by policymakers. And both sides are a little right. We've gotten very good at understanding disease vectors, but bad at respecting time, bad at understanding how long something can sleep, and how fast it can stretch once it wakes. One more strange detail: in 2004, a team from Sweden's Lund University found evidence of a sudden warming event 11,600 years ago that thawed permafrost over a few months. Global temperatures spiked, entire ecosystems shifted, some regions dried, others drowned. The cause unknown. But layers of ash found inside the ice suggest it wasn't just warming, it might have been fire. We tend to forget that cold and heat are married. One invites the other. Melting doesn't just unleash water, it unleashes history. Now lean in for a visual. You're walking across a field of tundra moss, and beneath your feet a bubble forms. You step and it wobbles like jelly. Beneath it, methane, ancient gases. You don't smell them yet, but give it time. These bubbles are popping more and more, releasing greenhouse gas in sudden plumes. The Earth's memory isn't stable, it's pressurized. And here's the real question, buried beneath the ice. What else is waiting? Not just diseases, not just carbon, but stories, carvings, letters, half-frozen books. There's a persistent rumor about a Roman-style helmet found in Canadian permafrost made of materials not native to North America. Never confirmed. But it only takes one find like that to rewrite everything. Or to panic everyone. Here's a delightfully weird story. In 2021, a Russian man walking his dog near the Kolyma River found a smooth stone shaped like a skull. Not unusual until he cracked it open, as you do with mysterious bone-shaped objects. Inside, fossilized beetles, perfectly preserved, and what looked like tiny geometric etchings. Probably natural. But he swore they pulsed in moonlight. Again, probably just vodka. But it's in the report. So where does that leave us? The Ice Age didn't end. It just paused, left behind notes, frozen clues, viruses, teeth, and prophecies we still don't know how to read. As the last snowflake melts in your mental theatre, picture the Earth as a nervous librarian finally losing its grip on the vault door. Not from negligence, just exhaustion. And as we close this chilly chapter, we descend now towards southern lands, where monks once gazed at exploding stars, and one recorded a fiery warning that science forgot, until the skies lit up again centuries later. The monastery clings to the hillside like moss-grey stones tucked beneath a lavender twilight. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, not for prayer, but for memory. In the year 1054, a Chinese court astronomer sits with his brush poised above silk paper, while across the world, a Syrian monk scratches the same star into parchment by candlelight. They don't know each other, but tonight they both see the sky burn. It starts as a bright pinprick above Taurus where there was no star yesterday, and now suddenly there is. Not flickering, not blinking, but constant, bright enough to be seen in the day. It stays for weeks, then slowly fades. Centuries later, we call it the Crab Nebula, what astronomers now know to be the remnants of a supernova. But to those who saw it in 1054, it was a divine wound torn through the heavens. Most records mention it only briefly. But one obscure Syriac text, a worn, untranslated page until the 1800s, tells a stranger story. The monk, likely named Bar Hebraeus, wrote of the eye of the lion opening for the first time in history. He claimed that those who looked into it dreamed of fire, and upon waking found their tongues tangled. Local villagers said children cried through the night, not from fear, but from awe, and then came the silence. Birds stopped singing, dogs stopped barking. The air, they said, felt thick. There was no apocalypse, no fire from the heavens, just a new star. And yet somehow this became one of the most quietly unnerving astronomical prophecies in pre-modern history. Flash forward to 2022. A team of astrophysicists studying Betelgeuse, another red supergiant in the Orion constellation, detects an unusual dimming. For a time, the internet buzzes with theories. Is it about to go supernova? Will we see another day star? Spoiler, it doesn't explode, but the idea sparks memories. People begin to dig. Forums reawaken the old prophecy from 1054. When the lion opens its eye, the wheel of language shall break. That's the phrase. And here's the thing, there are subtle records of widespread miscommunications during that year. Edicts miscopied, ship routes mischarted, a breakdown in a Greek-Byzantine trade negotiation over one-word salt. Historians still argue whether this language breaking is coincidence or creative pattern seeking. But the phrase comes back every time a star dims or flares in our sky. Now, your historical fact for this dreamy detour, the 1054 supernova was observed and recorded not just in China and the Middle East, but also likely by the ancestral Puebloans in North America. A rock carving in Chaco Canyon shows a star next to a crescent moon just as the supernova appeared in the night sky alongside a waning moon on July 5th, 1054. It's a star carved in stone, still glowing in the minds of the living. Here's a quirky one. In 1572, famed astronomer Tycho Brahe observed another new star in the sky. What we now know was a different supernova. He was so stunned that he abandoned the idea of unchanging heavens. But before the science kicked in, local peasants reportedly believed the star was a hole in heaven where angels looked down. Some claimed to feel watched during its glow. Whether that's theology or sleep deprivation, well, you decide. Now let's bring in our scholarly debate phrase. Astronomers still argue whether early supernova sightings were interpreted as divine signs or merely logged with observational detachment. In truth, it was likely both. The monk in our story didn't declare the end of days. He didn't call for repentance. He just described a shift, a tremor in the language of the stars. And maybe that's what prophecies really are. Not commands, but punctuation marks in time. Ready for joke number 5. Imagine being the poor monk who saw the sky burst open, spent months chronicling it, and then centuries later, everyone just names it crab. Tough legacy. Sounds like something you'd scrape off a tide pool rock, not a cosmic firework. And yet here's where it gets weird again. In 2018, a university linguist analysing Syriac manuscripts noticed that a particular phrase kept appearing in religious texts during the decades following 1054, the tongue slips sideways. It wasn't a metaphor. It was often used to describe moments when monks reportedly forgot how to speak during prayers. Entire sentences garbled, letters reversed, as if something in the sky had rearranged their thoughts. Modern medicine might call this a seizure, or a mass psychogenic event, or maybe they were just exhausted. But across 3 continents, the idea that a new star scrambled human speech just briefly persisted. There's an old superstition mostly forgotten now, that when a star is born bright enough to be seen during the day, it carries with it the thoughts of the dying star it came from. That's not science, but it feels poetic, doesn't it? So here's a sleepy idea to cradle for a moment. Well, what if some prophecies aren't predictions, but memories returning in disguise? What if a star's death echoes through our consciousness, like a sound we can't quite remember hearing? And as we wrap this celestial chapter, let's drop in your joke number 6. If stars really do whisper secrets, when they explode, someone should tell the James Webb Telescope to wear earmuffs. Picture it now, the monk standing beneath the blazing day star, his parchment catching fire. From a stray candle, the ink smudging just enough to turn language. She'll break into language, she'll bake. Maybe we got it all wrong. Maybe the prophecy was just a bad translation of a recipe. Now we leave the mountains and their burning skies behind, descending to dusty tombs and glass-eyed statues, where a child's warning in the shadow of an empire hinted at a curse too subtle to notice until it was far too late. The marble is warm from the sun, not hot just enough to confuse the senses, to make you forget you're standing in a tomb. Rome has fallen, but its ghosts linger in doorways, etched into the stone faces of broken emperors and cracked gods. Beneath one of those forgotten temples in a dusty vault, untouched for centuries, lies the body of a child, and in her hands, clasped gently, as if she were praying, is a scroll. They say she was the daughter of a minor official. Nothing royal, nothing famous, just another child lost to illness in the slow rot of a dying empire. But the scroll she holds, that's what haunts historians. It's short, just a few lines, written in Latin but in a strange looping dialect, almost as if the words had been bent. The last sentence reads, "When the cities echo like stone birds, the mouths will close and not open again." People thought it was poetic, a lament. But by the early 1600s, someone decided it was a prophecy. And once it was catalogued and copied, it picked up a nickname, the girl's silence. And here comes your historical fact. In 1656, Naples suffered a devastating outbreak of plague. Entire neighbourhoods were walled off and silenced. Priests walked through the streets, with censors chanting beneath their breath. But here's the strange part, and records from that year show a huge uptick in references to the girl's silence scroll. In letters, in sermons, even carved into the side of a monastery bell. People believed it predicted the plague, or at least the silence that came with it. No birds, no bells, just muffled footsteps and closed shutters. Now here's your quirky detail. A German traveller named Johann Faber, visiting Rome in 1629, claimed he saw the original scroll with his own eyes, and that the ink shimmered in candlelight as if it were still wet. He also said the child's bones were unusually small, like those of a bird. Scientists later speculated this might have been a case of brittle bone disease. But Faber, bless him, believed she wasn't human at all. We'll let you decide. And now, your scholarly debate phrase. Classicists still argue whether the scroll's phrasing reflects early Christian mysticism or represents a late pagan oracle. Basically, no one agrees on what she meant, or even if she meant anything at all. But like many forgotten prophecies, it slinks into history's cracks until the world gets quiet again. Here's where the story gets eerie. In 1942, during the Nazi occupation of Rome, Allied intelligence intercepted a coded German message that ended with an odd phrase, "The stone birds have begun." Historians later identified it as a reference to bombed-out cities, Rome, Naples, Milan, where pigeons roosted silently on the wreckage, no longer fluttering. The connection to the ancient scroll. Likely coincidence, but chilling nonetheless. Let's pause for joke number 7. If you ever find yourself clutching a prophetic scroll in a crypt, take a moment and ask, is this my destiny? Or did I just wander into the plot of a very expensive horror movie? And now we get to the oddest piece of the puzzle. In 1993, a Vatican archivist named Lucia Benassi wrote a private letter to a colleague mentioning a silent girl in the undercrypt who never blinked. Most assumed she was being poetic, or perhaps just very, very tired. But the letter sparked a brief rumour that the child's tomb had been secretly reopened and studied. That rumour faded quickly, but in 2008, during restoration work beneath the Basilica of San Clemente, workers uncovered a bricked-in chamber containing fragments of what appeared to be a second scroll, written in the same looping script on a material that wasn't papyrus but something closer to pressed silk. Most of it was unreadable, but one phrase stood out: "When the mouths turn inward, the rivers shall run wrong." Cheery stuff. Now for joke number 8, if ancient cryptic poetry ever starts matching the evening news, maybe skip the scroll reading and go straight to binge-watching cat videos. Safer. So where are we really with the girl's silence? Some say it's just metaphor, a symbolic warning about plagues and war. Others believe it's part of a lost tradition, prophecies written by children whose innocence was thought to grant clarity. A tradition that pops up in folklore, from many cultures, from the Sibyls of ancient Greece to the child prophets of West African myth. One scholar, very niche, very committed, believes the scroll was actually written after the child's death by someone else and placed in her hands as part of a posthumous ritual. If true, it shifts everything. It makes the child a vessel, not a voice. Here's something to sleep on. In 2017, a researcher at the University of Padua used machine learning software to compare the looping script of the scroll with hundreds of known Latin dialects. The result, a 63% match with an Etruscan funerary prayer. The Etruscans, of course, were long gone by the time this child died, but language like prophecy is sticky. It survives, it echoes, and sometimes it echoes in the silence between cities. So picture this, a girl beneath Rome, her fingers curled around words she never wrote, or maybe did. Above her empires crumble. Below the scroll remains warm to the touch, as if still breathing. We leave her now, gently, quietly. Our path winds next through burning fields and metal birds toward a dusty desert vision that foretold a technology so powerful it could undo not just cities, but memory itself. The sun is merciless here, not golden, not warm, blistering, blunt. It bakes the sand into glass and turns rocks into mirrors. The year is 1944. A convoy moves through the New Mexico desert, jeeps, trucks, and mines full of secrets. In one of those trucks, a physicist named Edward Teller clutches a notebook filled with equations that may change the world forever. And just a few hundred miles away, in a half-collapsed chapel near Taos, a priest finds a journal. It isn't labelled. No name, no date, just pages worn thin from sweat and age. Written in Spanish, but old, pre-republic, pre-modern. Some phrases don't even map neatly to today's grammar. It tells of a man who walks into the desert for 30 nights and returns with a single sentence burned into his memory. When men make light from ash, the sky will swallow itself. That's the prophecy, scrawled and repeated at the top of every page, as if the writer feared forgetting it. A fringe footnote in religious circles for decades, it's mostly ignored until July 16, 1945. Trinity, a name that sounds like divinity, but delivers something else entirely. The desert cracks open with the first successful test of an atomic bomb. Scientists, wide-eyed in the blast glow, later describe it as brighter than daylight. A light from ash. You probably know this historical fact. J. Robert Oppenheimer, upon witnessing the explosion, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." But what you might not know is that a guard stationed on the perimeter of the blast zone later wrote that the moment the shockwave hit him, he had the sudden, inexplicable urge to look straight up. Not forward, not down, but into the sky. It felt, he said, like the sky was looking back. Here's your quirky detail. After the Trinity test, several locals reported seeing a second sun hanging low in the morning haze. One elderly shepherd swore it blinked. Not pulsed, blinked twice. Others insisted they heard singing. Not mechanical, not natural, like the desert humming a warning. Historians still argue whether these accounts were hallucinatory side effects of the blast's shockwave or just vivid post-trauma storytelling. But either way, they echo something in that old priest's journal. You see, deeper in the pages past the repetitive prophecy, there's a second line, less repeated, harder to read. It says, "The birds will vanish first, the sand will melt, but the worst will come when no shadows fall." Cryptic, sure. But in the hours following the Trinity explosion, radiation levels were so high near the epicenter that one observer noted the absence of bird calls. Even insects were gone. The silence, he wrote, was too perfect. Joke number 9 incoming. When your prophecy starts reading like an OSHA violation checklist, you might be dealing with more than just poetic metaphors. Now here's where it gets uncanny. In 1962, during high-altitude nuclear testing, Project Starfish Prime, a US military team monitoring the artificial auroras noticed something strange. Not just the electrical disruption, not just the satellite failures, but silence. On one frequency, specifically reserved for long-range communication, static fell away and never came back. Just a clean, empty channel. That same frequency, it matched the radio band used by desert navigation beacons in the 1930s, used coincidentally near Taos. Now, we don't want to claim ghosts or time loops or singing sand here, but something about that quiet signal, disappearing then never returning, feels like an echo of that earlier line, when no shadows fall. It's the idea of a silence not from peace but from erasure. Joke. 10 time. When no shadows fall sounds less like a prophecy and more like the tagline for a Christopher Nolan movie you definitely fall asleep halfway through, but with great music. So who wrote that desert journal? No one knows. It vanished from church records sometime in the 1970s. A single copy exists in microfilm in a university archive. Most researchers pass over it because prophecy isn't exactly peer-reviewed science. And yet tucked in the footnotes of several atomic age memoirs is a reference to the priest's warning. Not always quoted, sometimes whispered. There's even a strange report from a military officer stationed at White Sands in the 1950s. In his diary, declassified in the early 2000s, he writes of dreaming about an old man wrapped in burnt cloth standing in the desert, repeating the phrase, "You lit the ash. Now watch the light forget you." He said the voice followed him for 3 nights. Dreams, paranoia, radiation sickness, maybe. But this idea of light forgetting is powerful. Because what is memory really but a shadow thrown by light? And what is prophecy but a memory we're not supposed to have yet? We circle back now to that phrase, the sky will swallow itself. Poetic, sure, but maybe also literal. In 2014, a cosmologist published a speculative paper about vacuum decay, the theoretical idea that the fabric of the universe could one day collapse due to a quantum instability. The resulting wave would erase everything at light speed with no warning. And what did the headlines say? The sky might one day vanish without trace. A mirror reflecting back through time, or maybe just a story we've always known. So here's your final image for tonight. The desert at dawn. The glassed earth still warm from something terrible. A scroll fluttering behind a broken chapel wall, ink barely clinging to parchment, waiting for the next reader. Waiting for you. We move now from scorched sand to green hills, where an old book with no author predicted a flood of digital ghosts long before electricity was ever imagined. The rain falls steadily here, thin and metallic, like coins being scattered from the clouds. England grey and soaked in moss. The year is 1732, and in the small village of Hathersage, tucked between the hills of Derbyshire, a schoolteacher stumbles across a book buried in the wall of a ruined chapel. No title, no author, just the faint outline of a hand pressed onto the back cover, as if someone had once pushed it closed in a hurry. The pages are dry, impossibly so, and inside, written in what appears to be a mixture of Old English and something eerily futuristic, are passages that don't belong in any known history. They speak of machines with no gears, voices with no mouths, and people whose names flicker between mirrors. One line repeats across several pages, almost like a refrain. When the dead speak louder, then the living memory will eat itself. At first, the schoolteacher, Mr. Owen Darby, bless his wet boots, assumes it's just another madman's ramblings. After all, this is the century of powdered wigs and scientific optimism. But something in the language sticks with him. Something in the phrasing feels out of place. Here's your historical fact. By the mid-18th century, England was entering the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines groaned to life. Cities belched smoke. And yet in this moment of iron and coal, someone had already written about digital ghosts machines that could speak remember and forget on behalf of the people they outlived. And here's your quirky detail. Inside the book, one page is completely blank, except for a strange ink drawing of what looks like a human face half erased, staring out from a box labelled Replay. To this day, scholars debate whether it was a prophetic image of a television or a warning against it. Historians still argue whether the book's author was drawing from lost knowledge or simply possessed a wildly creative imagination far ahead of its time. Either way, the writing is uncanny. Take this sentence: "The voice shall linger in the wire, even when the throat is ash." Creepy, right? But here's the kicker. Fast forward to 1967, when the first successful prototype of voice storage via magnetic tape was archived. An engineer jokingly labelled the final test recording Ghost Tape 0. When played back decades later, after the original speaker had died, the voice was perfectly preserved, down to the breath between syllables. Memory eating itself. Now joke tucked to 11. If your voice ever ends up on a ghost tape, you better hope your final words weren't, "Did I leave the oven on?" There's something chilling about that. The idea that long after your body goes cold, a device might still replay your laughter, your sorrow, your awkward stumbles through a birthday song. That's not immortality, it's recursion. In the book from Hathersage, eventually nicknamed the Mirror Codex, there's a full chapter dedicated to something called the folded hour. It describes a moment in time where every memory, every story is compressed into a light box and replayed endlessly until meaning collapses. The passage ends with, "When everything is remembered, nothing is real." And this, according to some 21st century scholars, sounds a whole lot like modern digital life. Infinite scrolling, algorithmic nostalgia, AI voices imitating the dead, simulated conversations with historical figures. Memories, yes, but curated, looped, and eventually hollowed out. It gets stranger. The codex contains a list, short entries, names and numbers, at first thought to be gibberish. But one 1982 researcher noticed something unsettling. A few of the numbers correspond to early US Social Security numbers issued long after the book was allegedly written. Coincidence, a forgery, or something else? And then there's the dream. Several owners of the codex over the years reported suffering from the same recurring nightmare, a narrow room filled with static, walls made of moving images, and in the centre, a chair facing a mirror. In the reflection, they always saw themselves, older, much older, speaking words they couldn't hear. The schoolteacher, Mr. Darby, wrote in his diary that after reading the book, clocks in his home began to stop at 3:14 a.m. every night. His cat refused to go near the fireplace, and once he awoke to find the codex moved to the foot of his bed, though he always locked it away before sleeping. Now, joke knock at 12. Look, if your antique book starts moving on its own, it's time to politely return it to whatever haunted crypt you stole it from, and maybe take up baking instead. Despite everything, Darby kept the book until his death in 1747. He left instructions for it to be buried with him. It wasn't. Local legend says the gravedigger refused, claiming he saw pages flipping themselves as if caught in a wind that wasn't there. The codex resurfaced in 1923 in the estate of an eccentric collector. Then again, in 2006, when a digital scan appeared anonymously on a hidden corner of the internet, deep web metadata scrambled. Only fragments were readable, but one line stood out. "They will not die. When they die, they will loop." It was quickly dismissed as a modern hoax, but those who read it often claimed they started hearing their own voice, slightly delayed echoing after they spoke, as if their words were being rerouted. Science fiction, probably. Prophecy, possibly. Here's a thought to keep you up a little longer tonight. If a book from the 1700s truly foresaw a world where voices, faces, even choices, are endlessly copied and preserved, what does it say about us now? Are we living memories, or are we already ghosts in someone else's archive? Picture this: a hillside soaked in rain, a room of forgotten film reels spinning in the dark, and somewhere deep in a digital vault, a flickering file named UDMP4 plays on a loop long after your story ends. We leave England now, crossing into stranger terrain, where a farmer's dusty vision, sketched into clay, warned of a planet's tilt, and a world turned upside down. The dirt is red here, thick, clinging to boots like wet rust. We're in Argentina now, Patagonia to be exact. 1876. A land of wind-flattened trees, endless sky, and the kind of silence that stretches between mountains like an ancient breath. On a sheep farm that barely scrapes together a living, an old man named Esteban Quesada spends his nights etching symbols into clay tiles. Not for art, not for worship, but because he claims the wind told him to. No one believes Esteban, of course. Not his family, not the village priest, and certainly not the government inspector, who once tried to classify his work as agricultural hallucination. But he keeps going night after night, carving lines, arrows, circles over and over into hand-shaped bricks, until eventually someone notices a pattern. The symbols don't look like anything familiar. Not Incan, not Mapuche, not Christian. But when viewed from above, laid out in a grid, they resemble a star chart, or maybe a tilt diagram, like the Earth leaning sideways. Esteban calls it El Gran Vuelco, the Great Tipping. This is the prophecy, or more accurately, the warning. When ice meets fire beneath a twisted moon, the ground shall sigh and forget its place. Now let's pause for your historical fact. Earth's axis has shifted several times in the planet's history. True polar wander, glacial rebound, and precession cycles all play a role. While dramatic shifts take millennia, scientists in the late 20th century began noticing that melting polar ice, particularly from Greenland, was subtly altering the distribution of Earth's mass. In 2021, the planet's axis was observed drifting eastward by centimeters sure, but unnervingly fast. Esteban didn't know any of this, of course. He was just a shepherd with a bad leg and an obsession with clay. But here's your quirky detail. One of his tiles contains an etched date, 4.12.2043, and next to it, the shape of a compass cracked in half. The tile was found buried beneath his house after a flash flood in 1893. Alongside it, scrawled into the base of a wooden chest, was the phrase, "The day the compass fails, no road shall stay true." Sounds poetic, or ominous, or both. Fast forward to the early 2000s, scientists monitoring the magnetic North Pole report that it's drifting unusually fast, about 50 kilometers per year. Planes have to recalibrate their navigation systems. Some animals, like birds and turtles, start exhibiting strange migration patterns. Nothing apocalyptic, but odd, unnerving. Historians still argue whether Esteban's carvings were inspired by a kind of cultural dreaming, or whether he tapped into some deeper ancient knowledge passed orally through generations. Whatever the source, he wrote of an event he called El Segundo Aliento, the second breath, described as a moment when the sky pulls back like an eyelid and the wind forgets its direction. One entry describes people standing upright as the horizon tilts like a bowl and clouds race backward. Joke number 13. If your sky starts acting like it's been spun around 3 times in a blindfold, it might be time to duck. Esteban was dismissed as a harmless madman. Yet in 1972, a geologist named Clara Mendoza stumbled across fragments of his tiles during a rural field study. She initially assumed them to be children's playthings, until she noticed a set of concentric circles perfectly matching early 20th century seismograph readings of tectonic tremors near the Andes. The shapes were drawn decades before modern seismographs even existed. Coincidence, maybe. Except that next to those circles was a phrase etched in Spanish that roughly translates to the breath before the quake. Mendoza published her findings in an obscure geology journal. No one noticed. Not until a NASA researcher, browsing old articles for fun, came across her paper in 2019 and flagged it as geospatially curious. 1 week later, he reportedly started receiving anonymous emails, one of which simply read, "Quesada was right." No sender, no signature, just the phrase. Here comes joke number 14. You know a prophecy's legit when even NASA won't touch it without burner emails. Now, here's where it gets chilling. A fragment of one of Esteban's later tiles, cracked and warped by time, bears a strange pair of mirrored symbols, one shaped like a mountain, the other like a spiral. When digitally enhanced, they resemble the early iconography for tectonic plate boundaries and oceanic trenches, again knowledge Esteban could not have possibly possessed. But the most unsettling piece, a series of small irregular dots grouped together in 3s and 7s. At first, scholars believed they were random, but then a mathematician, curious about Esteban's obsession with numbers, ran them through a basic binary conversion. It spelled out "there is no north," a phrase that haunts geologists and navigators alike, because if the Earth's magnetic field continues to degrade, as some projections suggest, there may come a time when compasses spin uselessly. Satellites could lose alignment. Global positioning. Gone. And as Esteban wrote decades before, such things even existed. When the sky forgets where down is man, shall walk straight into the void. It's the kind of line that feels too dramatic to be true, until you remember that in 2022 an international team of climate researchers published a paper warning that changes in Earth's magnetic field could begin disrupting birds, whales, and even atmospheric currents within our lifetimes. They titled it "Winds Without Anchors." It echoed something Esteban wrote long before: "The winds shall have no tether, and the sea shall rise like glass." One final note on the farmer. He never sold a tile, never asked to be believed. Just carved night after night, until his hands gave out. He died alone during a freak windstorm, his house lifted off its foundation, like paper. Witnesses say his body was found seated at his workbench, clay under his fingernails, and a single unbaked tile beside him. On it, the earth turns once, then again, then no more. That's the kind of thing that makes your skin prickle. Not because it sounds like science, but because it sounds like truth wrapped in myth, waiting for the right century to understand it. So sleep tight with that image, a forgotten farmer, the wind as his teacher carving warnings into a world that hadn't yet learned how to listen. Now we tilt again away from shifting earth and into the cold stillness of the stars, where a Babylonian cylinder may have predicted not only the fall of empires, but the death of the moon. A single candle flickers against ancient stone, casting long, shivering shadows across the chamber wall. The scent of damp clay mingles with the fainter trace of dried incense. We're far back now, into the cradle of civilization. Mesopotamia, somewhere near modern-day Iraq, around 650 BCE. In the vault of a ziggurat lost to time, a scribe kneels beside a clay cylinder, his stylus hovering above wet surface. What he's writing isn't law or tribute, or a prayer. It's a warning. And it begins with the words, "When the moon forgets her shadow, the sky shall unravel." They call it the Namtaru cylinder, named after a lesser-known Babylonian deity of disease and death. But there's little about illness in these cuneiform impressions. Instead, what follows reads like a cross between celestial mechanics and apocalyptic poetry. It speaks of lunar eclipses occurring out of season, of a sister sun veiled in flame, of tides that vanish and then return doubled. For centuries the object is ignored, misfiled, thought to be part of a larger harvest record. But in 1924 a German archaeologist, Herr Dr. Karl Besser, discovers the complete translation and grows deeply disturbed. The cylinder appears to describe not just one, but multiple lunar events with impossible precision. Twice shall the night become day, yet no sunrise. The third time, the moon shall break. Here's your historical fact. In 1999, astrophysicists confirmed the moon is slowly receding from Earth by about 3.8 centimeters per year. Over millions of years, this drift affects tides, Earth's rotation, and even climate patterns. But according to fringe theorists, sudden gravitational disruptions could cause abrupt shifts, especially if a major astronomical event, like a rogue planetary object or solar flare, occurred. Which brings us to this strange truth: the Namtaru cylinder contains what appears to be a calculation. Etched alongside its riddled lines is a spiral of dots separated into groups of 28, 365, and 9. Early scholars believed this to be a ritual calendar, but a recent study suggested something chilling. It may correspond to cycles of lunar apogee, solar years, and a countdown to what no one knows. Your quirky detail for tonight: one of the cylinder's glyphs, a rare form of the god Sin symbol, looks like a cracked disc with jagged edges, a broken moon. Sin, the moon, god was never associated with lunar destruction in Mesopotamian mythology. This anomaly has baffled scholars since its discovery. And yes, historians still argue whether this depiction of a shattered moon is symbolic, or a literal fear based on a celestial event witnessed long ago. Because here's the twist: in 2008, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter captured high-res images of deep fractures beneath the moon's crust, called lobate scarps, suggesting tectonic-like activity. Some scientists speculate the moon is shrinking ever so slightly, nowhere near a collapse but enough to raise an eyebrow. And now, joke tagcholos 15. So if the moon starts making creaking noises, it's either breaking apart or she's just getting up from a 1,000-year nap. Back to Besser, the poor man who first sounded the alarm. After publishing his initial findings, he withdrew from public life, claimed he was receiving night messages through dreams, visions of the moon hanging too low, its surface crawling with unreadable eyes. His colleagues mocked him, of course, but when he died in 1937, his journal contained one last note: "It weeps light, not for us but for itself." Hard to say if that's lunacy or poetry. Now consider this: the cylinder was found in a collapsed corridor, alongside a second smaller object, a lump of black glass. Ancient Mesopotamians had no known method for manufacturing such material. It bore no markings, but under UV light, researchers observed faint radiating lines, as if something once burst from its center. Coincidence, perhaps. But in the Namtaru cylinder, there's mention of the burning drop which falls from the sky like a child cast out and cracks the silver face of the night. That line has been interpreted in many ways. Some say it's mythic metaphor for a meteor. Others believe it refers to something more ominous. In 2013, a minor moonquake, yes, that's a thing, registered vibrations that puzzled analysts. The tremors lasted longer than expected, and some speculated about unusual densities within the lunar crust. One geophysicist, in a rather dramatic blog post, wrote, "It rang like a bell, but something inside stopped the echo." Strange phrase, especially when paired with a line from the Namtaru cylinder: "The bell shall toll where no air carries sound." More myth or more memory long buried in loam and legend. Joke number 16. Imagine the moon breaks apart, and all we get is a bunch of influencers live streaming it with hashtags like Lunar Shatter 2029. But seriously, if the ancients truly witnessed a celestial event that scarred them deeply enough to encode it in clay, what are we missing? Did they see a partial eclipse so severe it appeared to break the moon? Was it an asteroid grazing the surface? Or are we simply projecting our modern fears backward onto fragments of a forgotten story? Still, here's a final whisper of wonder. In 2017, a physicist named Dr. Layla Grange found that the math carved into the Namtaru cylinder, dismissed for centuries, mirrored certain formulas used in orbital resonance calculations. In other words, someone 2,600 years ago may have grasped the rhythm of celestial bodies better than we assumed. She called it an ancient code of night. And that's what stays with you, isn't it? The idea that long before modern science, someone watched the sky break pattern, watched the moon go strange, and decided to write it down, not in fear, but in the desperate hope that one day someone would understand. So let that settle under your skin tonight, that somewhere in a vault under broken stone and starlit dust, an old piece of clay waits patiently for us to remember what we've forgotten. And tomorrow night, we journey to the Arctic Circle, where a shaman's final chant may have foreseen the silence of the sun. The air here is thinner, crisp, so dry it snaps the inside of your nose like static. We're far north now, inside the Arctic Circle, midnight sun territory, though tonight it's the opposite, a darkness so deep even the snow looks black. Somewhere near the northeastern edge of modern-day Siberia, a nomadic Evenki tribe gathers around a fire that crackles like it's trying to speak. It's the 1700s, cold, brutal, silent. Their shaman, called Chulorin, has been quiet for days. He hasn't eaten, barely slept. He keeps staring at the sky, muttering to himself in a language that even the elders don't fully recognize. Tonight he breaks the silence. His chant is slow, rhythmic. It carries a different cadence, less like a prayer, more like a record. And what he speaks of isn't gods or spirits. It's light, or rather, the absence of it. He calls it the hollow sun. According to the tribe's oral history passed down for generations, there comes a time, every few thousand winters, when the sun doesn't just disappear from the sky, it disappears from itself. Still glowing, yes. still warm enough to thaw a bit of snow on your glove, but different, hollow, as if something inside it has been stolen. Here's your historical fact. During the early 19th century, astronomers began documenting what would later be known as the Maunder Minimum, a 70-year period when sunspots nearly vanished from the solar surface. This strange solar dormancy coincided with what's now called the Little Ice Age, a time when Europe and parts of Asia experienced brutally cold winters, failing crops, and shortened growing seasons. But back in the Arctic, Ullrich has no telescope, no charts, just his instinct and the whispers of birds who flew south far too early. His prophecy passed down in fragments translates roughly to this: when the sun forgets to breathe, the sky will grow brittle, and warmth will become memory. He describes a period of sky hunger, when trees will forget to flower, and the ground won't remember how to thaw. He also speaks of a great silence, a silence not of sound but of movement. The wind will lay down, the rivers will not run, and the air will hold its breath for 7 seasons. Sound dramatic? Maybe, but let's add your quirky detail here. The Evenki kept a series of ceremonial reindeer skulls, each marked with burned lines tracking yearly weather. One skull, dated by modern researchers to the 1740s, contains notches consistent with severe temperature drops, blizzards in spring, and total absence of birdsong across multiple months. It's the only skull to have a red line burned straight down the middle. According to legend, this marked the sun that slept. Historians still argue whether this reflects actual meteorological phenomena or was simply a mythological way to explain harsh winters. But here's where it gets interesting. Several accounts from 18th century Russian trappers in the same region mention a period of eerily still weather, no wind, no snowstorms, just a stagnant cold that lasted far too long. And in 1739, a Jesuit missionary stationed near Yakutsk wrote in his diary, "The sun is pale like a pearl behind cloth. It gives light but no heat. The people believe it is sick." Now we shift to something modern. Solar scientists today monitor what's known as the solar cycle, an approximately 11-year pattern of magnetic activity that governs everything from sunspots to flares. But every few hundred years, it goes quiet, deep quiet. Some speculate we're heading toward another such minimum soon, an extended solar lull. Imagine a winter where your phone still charges, but your garden won't grow, where power grids survive, but crops wither for lack of warmth. A world bathed in dim, distant sunlight. That doesn't quite feel alive. Joke Duckuha 17. Great first. The moon breaks now, the sun's on vacation. Who's steering this solar system anyway? Back to you, Lauren. His final chant, reportedly recited just before he vanished into a forest during a snowstorm, ends with these words: "The ice shall rise not as a blade but as a veil, and behind it the sun will blink, not closed but sideways." It doesn't make much sense until you remember that during solar minimums, the sun's magnetic poles weaken, and occasionally they flip. A sideways blink indeed. Now here's where it gets creepy. In 2010, researchers digging near Lake Elgagitgin say that 5 times fast uncovered a tree ring sample that showed abnormally stunted growth around 1741, the exact time Ullrich gave his final prophecy. Paired with ice core data, it suggests a brief but intense cold anomaly likely caused by diminished solar radiation. Coincidence, perhaps. But when those same researchers cross-referenced their findings with sunspot records from Chinese astronomers, they found corroborating evidence of a strange lull in solar activity, one that lasted just under a decade. And what did Ullrich say? 7 seasons. Joke Nushunort 18. So if your crops fail, your phone stops working, and you start wearing 3 coats in August, just blame the sun, forgetting how to do its job. Still, the idea of a hollow sun lingers. Not because we expect the sun to vanish, but because history shows us that even stars have moods, phases, times when they go quiet and Earth listens harder. In 2019, a professor in Finland published a paper exploring cultural memory of solar anomalies. Her theory that pre-modern societies encoded astronomical anomalies into ritual and myth, not as fear-mongering, but as survival tools. Memory vaults meant to be activated when the signs reappeared. and Ullarin's chant could be one of those vaults. So tonight as you sleep, think of him not as a wild-eyed mystic, but as a kind of celestial archivist. A man who looked at a pale sun and thought, this isn't just cold, this is different, and who tried in the only way he knew how to make sure that message reached someone someday. And tomorrow, we ride the railways of Victorian England, where a quiet station master may have seen a vision of trains that never arrive, and time that stutters. Steam hisses, wheels grind, and a bell echoes down the line like a half-remembered dream. It's the year 1885, and we're standing on the moss-fringed platform of a rural English railway station, Winsthorpe Holt. If you're wondering why you've never heard of it, you're not alone. It's a whistle stop in the middle of nowhere, tucked into a fold of Yorkshire hillside, and forgotten even by most maps. But for one man, this place is unforgettable. His name is Edwin Roke, station master, widower, known for reading Dickens aloud to his cat. And according to the lone journal he left behind, he may have been the first modern human to witness a kind of temporal slip. It starts on a foggy November morning. The 6:42 out of Dunning Vale never arrives. Roke checks the line. No obstruction. He signals again. Nothing. He marks it down as a delay. But the same thing happens the next day, and the next, except here's the catch: the train does arrive at Dunning Vale. It departs as scheduled, but somewhere along the 6 miles of track between there and Winsthorpe, it simply ceases. The company sends inspectors. They find nothing. One blames a misprint on the timetable. Another suggests the train never ran at all. But then a local boy, a shepherd's son, claims he saw the 6:42 floating in the air, turning sideways like a fly in amber. Naturally, everyone assumes he's been sniffing too much sheep glue. Until Roke writes this, I stood by the tracks. I saw the rails curve like they'd forgotten how to be straight. The fog wasn't real fog. It hummed. Here's your historical fact. During the late 1800s, Britain saw a spike in reports of phantom trains. These were sightings of locomotives that vanished before reaching their destination or appeared to pull into stations never listed on any timetable. Most were dismissed as overactive imaginations fueled by the Industrial Revolution's anxiety. But Winsthorpe Holt kept showing up in odd places. A railway ledger from 1901 lists repairs made to a stretch of track between Winsthorpe and the 9th mile, even though Winsthorpe was officially decommissioned 5 years earlier. A maintenance crew reported seeing a train without windows, utterly silent, standing still, despite no visible track. Then there's your quirky detail tucked inside the journal of a railway clerk named Harriet Broom, was a pressed piece of lavender and a timetable from 1893 with the note, Winsthorpe returns, scribbled beside the 6:42. Harriet vanished the following winter, her last known location boarding a train to Dunning Vale. Historians still argue whether these anomalies reflect superstitious folklore surrounding early rail travel or are rooted in misunderstood physics. But there's one part they can't explain, a telegraph operator's log dated December 7th, 1894. It records a message sent from Winsthorpe, time-stamped 6:47 a.m., 5 minutes after the train should have arrived. The message reads, "It is looping, do not answer, tell no one." No such operator was assigned that day. The station had been shuttered for months. Let's zoom out for a moment. In modern terms, scientists speak of time dilation and gravitational lensing phenomena that distort perception near massive bodies or high-speed movement. But in 2016, an obscure paper from the University of Exeter proposed something stranger, that intense electromagnetic conditions, paired with geomagnetic anomalies, could briefly create temporal shadows, areas where cause and effect blur, where something doesn't happen, yet still leaves a trace. And where was one of the UK's most intense geomagnetic anomalies recorded? Near Yorkshire, along an old disused rail line. Joke Nutter 19. Somewhere out there is a Victorian train that's still trying to make it to Winsthorpe. Hope the snacks cart had enough tea. Back to Edwin Roke. His final journal entry is dated March 3rd of 1886. The train came back. It had no lights, no passengers, but I heard my name not spoken remembered. I stepped aboard. He was never seen again. Searchers found only his cap on the platform and a track that ended not in rust but in fresh iron, as though it had just been laid. That would be enough to dismiss this as quaint railway ghost lore, if it weren't for what happened in 2007. A hiker named Lewis Pendle went off course during a ramble near Yorkshire. He stumbled onto a half-buried sign that read, Winsthorpe Halt, thought it odd, took a picture. Only when he developed the film did he notice something strange on the sign was a reflection not of the woods behind him, but of an old train platform. Empty, impossibly clean. And in the corner of the photo, faintly a date. March 3 of 1886. Cue chill down the spine music. Joke number 20. If you ever see a train with lace curtains and nobody talking, do not get on. Just wave politely and pretend you're waiting for Uber. So what are we to make of this, a vanishing train? A fog that hums. A man who steps out of time like he's answering an invitation from nowhere. Maybe it's all coincidence. Maybe it's just the poetic sadness of the steam age, echoing through empty tunnels and warped rails. But maybe, just maybe, some moments don't pass. They loop. Waiting for someone sensitive enough to feel the ripple and curious enough to walk into it. Tonight you might dream of that station. You won't find it on any map. But if you ever hear a whistle in the distance when no tracks are near, or feel that tug of memory for a place you've never been, check your watch. It might not be moving forward anymore. Tomorrow we dive into the manuscript hidden inside a saint's tomb, one that speaks of the year with no language. Inside the Basilica di San Lorenzo in Florence, beneath centuries of incense smoke and the quiet reverence of pilgrims, there lies a tomb that few visitors linger near. It's cool to the touch granite lined with gold filigree and carries a name more whispered than spoken, Santa Dolcissima delle Parole Perdute, Sant Dolcissima of the Lost Words. She's not officially recognised by the Vatican, which isn't terribly surprising given what's buried with her. The manuscript is brittle, leather-bound. Hidden inside a hollowed compartment beneath her resting place, it wasn't discovered until 1951 during a restoration. The church dismissed it as a curiosity, 114 pages of cramped Latin Greek and something that looks a lot like Aramaic. But one linguist, Father Matteo Rinaldi, took it home. And after 3 sleepless months, he translated a phrase that turned his blood cold. In the year when language dies, the earth shall forget itself. That's right, we're talking about a prophecy not of war or fire, but of something far stranger, a year where humanity can no longer understand itself. Hey guys, hope you're still cozy. Here's your historical fact. In 536 AD, the Byzantine historian Procopius described what he called a year without sun. For over 12 months, the skies darkened, temperatures plummeted, and crops failed across Europe and Asia. But here's what's often overlooked. Multiple chroniclers across different cultures also mention something peculiar, the loss of communication. Languages, shifting words, no longer meaning what they once did, confusion even among native speakers. Now think about that. A disruption not just of food or light, but of understanding. The manuscript found in St. Dulcissima's tomb goes further. It tells of a time when tongues will grow heavy and eyes will not read. It describes scrolls that no longer make sense, elders whose stories dissolve mid-sentence, and children who speak only in sounds that mirror but do not carry meaning. And here's your quirky detail. Several pages of the manuscript are written in mirrored script. Left to right, right to left, top to bottom, some even upside down. One passage, when reversed and read phonetically in Latin, roughly says, "When the sky drinks ink, the mind will thirst for silence." Historians still argue whether this manuscript is a genuine relic from late antiquity or a Renaissance-era forgery meant to invoke medieval fears of Babel. But linguists who've examined the syntax agree it doesn't match any known European structure from the period. It's as if the author was imitating language rather than speaking it. Flash forward to 2020. During lockdown, a team of researchers studying cognitive regression in aging populations noticed a small spike in aphasia cases among younger adults, seemingly healthy people mid-sentence unable to retrieve basic words, like lamp or kitchen. No head trauma, no viral infection, just a static glitch. The phenomenon was dubbed transient linguistic decoupling and most cases resolved in minutes. Still it echoes the manuscript's line, "Words will hover just outside the grasp. Names will taste like metal." And yes, we know what you're thinking. Maybe that's just modern burnout, or screen fatigue, or the effects of isolation. But then comes the weird part. An AI model trained to transcribe 5,000 years of global literature showed an unexpected dip in coherence scores starting in 2019. Across all languages, all genres, a subtle but measurable wobble in the precision of communication. Words that once held stable associations began to fuzz. Joke Nutshell. Imagine finally finishing that novel only to discover you wrote it in invisible ink and half the chapters are now recipes. Back in Florence, a final page from the Dolcissima manuscript reads, "The tower fell once in stone. The second time it shall fall in silence." A callback, of course, to the biblical Tower of Babel, when humanity's unified language shattered into thousands, scattering comprehension like broken glass. But what if the danger isn't too many languages, but none? The theory isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. In cognitive science, language is tightly bound to identity. Strip it away, and thought itself starts to unravel. We name to know. We speak to stabilize. Lose the structure, and what's left? In 2006, a neurologist studying epilepsy noted something curious. During certain temporal lobe seizures, patients lost language temporarily, but not thought. They described it as floating in meanings they couldn't access, or knowing things they couldn't name. One patient called it the year inside my head where nothing had labels. Just like the manuscript says. Joke Nupka 22. You know it's bad when even your dreams are subtitled in a language you don't recognize. Maybe Saint Dolcissima never spoke with angels? Maybe she just saw something coming. A time when knowledge would fracture not through ignorance, but through noise. When the tools we use to make sense of reality stop working. You can already feel it sometimes, can't you? The news becomes static. Texts blur. Conversations feel like echoes of arguments that never happened. Words no longer satisfy. We reach for something deeper, but don't know what it is. Language, like electricity, is invisible until it flickers. So tonight, as you drift off, listen closely, not just to the voices around you, but to the ones inside. Are they clear, or are they starting to hum? If meaning ever slips from your grasp, remember Dolcissima, not as a saint perhaps, but as a woman who buried a warning, and who hoped centuries later you'd still be able to read it. Tomorrow we journey to a desert that doesn't appear on maps, where a tribe guards a prophecy carved into wind-eroded stone about a storm that undoes memory itself. Beneath a scorched sky where clouds rarely gather and the wind cuts in spirals instead of straight lines, there lies a desert known only in whispers, the Maktal Wastes. You won't find it on any map, and even satellite images seem to blur inexplicably when panned over this stretch of North African rock and sand. It's not a glitch, it's what the desert wants. At the heart of it, surrounded by petrified dunes and half-buried cairns, stands a sandstone arch marked with symbols that don't match any known language. They're geometric, almost algorithmic, like if the earth itself had once dreamed in math. And according to the oral tradition of the Sekeni tribe, that arch is the gateway to memory's last breath. They call it the storm of forgetting. Here's your historical fact. During the 13th century, the famous Arab explorer Ibn Battuta recorded a tale from a nomadic elder in what is now southern Algeria. The man spoke of a place where no name survives the wind, and a storm that once seen makes a man forget his own mother's face. Battuta dismissed it as myth until curiously 3 of his own caravan members reportedly went mute for days after camping in the area. But to the Sekeni, it's not a myth, it's a prophecy. It begins like this: when the red wind spins counter to the sun, the storm will rise and memory shall return to sand. So what is the storm of forgetting? It's not fire, not rain. It's something closer to a pulse, an atmospheric shockwave that deletes not data, but the ability to hold on to it. And every few decades, the Sekeni say, it stirs, just briefly. You feel it first in your fingertips, a tingling, then a sudden inexplicable loss. Your mother's voice, the name of your first pet, the feeling of what it meant to be 10. Some anthropologists chalk it up to local legend, wrapped around real phenomena: sandstorms, with high static electricity, dehydration, induced disorientation, maybe even exposure to trace neurotoxins from underground mineral deposits. Historians still argue whether the Sekeni stories reflect genuine environmental effects or symbolic cultural memory, but the tribe insists the storm is neither metaphor nor metaphorical. And here's your quirky detail. One Sekeni shaman, recorded in 1928 by a French missionary, claimed the storm erases not only people, but places. He said he had once lived in a village, now completely unknown even to his own kin. When asked to draw it, he sketched a layout matching that of an Iron Age settlement unearthed in 2009, over 300 miles away. Coincidence or echo? Let's cut to 1971. A British geologist named Dr. Lionel Garrick disappears while surveying fault lines near the Mactal Wastes. His equipment is later recovered, but every photo on his camera roll is overexposed except one. It shows the sandstone arch, and around it, faint blurs, humanoid but translucent. Like the ghosts of people not quite forgotten, or perhaps not quite remembered. The real mystery, though, is Garrick's final recorded note, written in shaking script on the back of a topographic map. I no longer know what I am for. Joke not 23. That's one way to describe a quarter-life crisis, or a trip to IKEA without a list. But it's not just Garrick. In 2003, a team of cultural researchers from Cairo attempt to film the Sekeni's annual naming rite, a ritual where the tribe recounts every name passed down orally across generations. The footage is strange. For the first hour, everything's normal. The recitation is rhythmic, melodic, beautiful. But then mid-name something shifts. The speaker pauses, blinks, starts again. Different names, then again. New sequence. The camera jitters, wind picks up. One crew member later described the sensation as being inside a dream someone else forgot to finish. Later analysis revealed the tape has sections of blank audio. Not static, not noise, just absence, like a page was torn out of time itself. Joke 24. We've all been there mid-sentence trying to remember why you walked into a room. Except now, the room might never have existed. The prophecy speaks of a final storm. One not contained to the desert, but global. The undoing storm. It won't erase buildings or data. It'll leave all the information exactly where it was. You just won't remember why it mattered. No passwords, no maps, no sense of sequence. History itself. A blur of dates you can't feel. The Sekeni warn that when the final storm rises, people will still speak, but the words will mean nothing to them. Entire nations will forget why they were angry, or kind, or afraid, and what follows will not be silence. It will be noise without memory. Joke Nasa 25. Honestly, that sounds like most online comment sections. In 2018, a linguist named Neela Banerjee visited the region and asked a Sekeni elder, "What should we do when the final storm comes?" He stared at her for a long time, then said, "Hold a stone, hum a song, and love someone as if it's your last hour." Then he looked confused, asked who she was. He'd forgotten the conversation before it ended. So tonight, as your breath slows and your eyes begin to drift, let this question drift through the static. What memories define you? Could you rebuild yourself without them? If not, tuck one memory deep tonight. One small quiet moment that no wind can carry away. Because if the storm ever comes and the world forgets your name, you may need something to remember who you once were. Tomorrow we'll scale a mountain in the Carpathians, where monks once sealed a gate, one that leads not to hell, but to a version of Earth that never happened. It begins with footsteps, always footsteps. Worn smooth into stone that should be too jagged to hold them, they form a spiral path up a lonely mountain in the Carpathians, near the border of modern-day Romania and Ukraine. The locals call it Muntele Foranum, the mountain without a name. Not because it was forgotten, but because they claim it never had one to begin with. And at the summit, hidden by mist more persistent than weather has any right to be, stands an ancient monastery. Abandoned, decaying and strangely intact, despite centuries of wind and snow. This is where the monks of the Order of St. Michael once lived, an order whose records were erased not by fire nor neglect, but by decree, because of what they sealed inside. Hey there, still with me? Here's your historical fact. In 1408, Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler, ordered an entire monastic sect to be removed from time after reports reached his court of strange happenings in the northern ranges. Monks who walked backwards, bells that rang before storms, and a chamber deep beneath the mountain that supposedly held a map, not of Earth as it was, but of Earth as it might have been. The prophecy the monks preserved spoke of a gate, a tier in the structure of reality, a doorway through which not demons but alternate histories could pass, not parallel timelines in the sci-fi sense, more like versions of our world that almost happened but didn't. Realities filtered out like static vibrating just beneath the floorboards of what we think of as real. According to their final written scroll hidden in a false altar and discovered by a team of hikers, in 1993, the monks once glimpsed an Earth where Rome never fell, where North America remained untouched by colonizers, where fire was never harnessed, and where humanity never spoke. And that gate, they called it Porta Taciri, the Gate of Silence. Here's your quirky detail. Every spring, equinox, the winds around the summit change pitch just slightly. Locals say, if you stand with your back to the cliff and listen, you'll hear what sounds like whispers in reverse. Not quite language, not quite noise, just enough to make your skin tighten and your instincts tell you you're not supposed to be here. Historians still argue whether the monastery is truly medieval or a more recent construct built atop older ruins, but radiocarbon dating of some interior beams place it around the year 1100. Interestingly, that's also the first recorded mention of the century of quiet when dozens of villages across Eastern Europe report a generation born without storytellers, chroniclers, or oral traditions, a blank spot in cultural memory. The theory? The Gate of Silence was open then, briefly. In 2001, an expedition led by Dr. Carlin Hovarth used ground-penetrating radar beneath the ruins. What they found defies clean explanation. There's a sealed chamber, perfectly spherical, 33 meters wide, no entrance, but get this, there's movement inside. Something slow, rhythmic, like the turning of gears or breathing. Joke number 26. Maybe it's just a very shy boulder doing yoga. The monks left behind a single artifact now housed in an undisclosed private collection, a stone disc etched with concentric rings of symbols. They appear random until you spin the disc. Then the symbols align into repeating patterns like clockwork or a calendar. One ring is marked with our known historical events full of Constantinople discovery of the America's moon landing. But the outer ring shows different ones. Events that never happened. Battles never fought. Continents never touched. One is labelled chillingly, the year we turned inside out. That one hasn't happened yet. Here's where it gets weird. A few independent researchers believe the disc is a kind of metaphysical compass pointing not to north, but to proximity to variant realities. As if reality has contours and we're drifting near an edge, which could explain the monastery's true purpose, not to worship, but to guard the seam. Joke number 27, either that or they were just really private introverts. The last page of the final monk's journal, dated March 1st, 1481, ends with this line. We sealed the gate not to keep them out, but to keep us in. So what does the prophecy warn? It says that when the boundary weakens, dreams will forget to wake, and people will begin to remember things that never happened. Entire generations will recall wars they never fought, songs never sung parents who don't exist. History will split not violently but gently, like a page curling in slow fire. And no one will notice until it's too late, until we all begin to remember wrong. Sound familiar? In the last few years, researchers have noted an uptick in false collective memories. The Mandela effect, yes, but more precise. People remember roads existing where none do, entire TV shows that never aired, even languages they think they used to speak. Not nostalgia, not misremembering. Echoes of other Earths. The monks believe the Gate of Silence pulses every 600 years, and if you're counting, we're due. So tonight, as your body slows and your thoughts drift, consider this. What if that moment when you couldn't remember whether an event really happened wasn't a lapse? What if it was a signal, a sign that the gate is opening again ever so slightly and letting in slivers of lives we never lived? What would you do if tomorrow everything felt just a little off? Would you even notice, or would you simply slide into the new reality, never quite sure why? Your favourite song doesn't exist anymore. Tomorrow, we reach the end. A final prophecy whispered in the still air of an empty theatre, one that speaks of the day the dream itself dreams back. A single stage, a theatre with no audience, velvet seats empty. Dust hangs in the air, sparkling in the faded gold light of a chandelier that shouldn't still be on. And on the stage a script rests on a stand, weathered, handwritten, and incomplete. This is Teatro della Nebbia, the theatre of mist. Tucked away in a fog-heavy corner of northern Italy, in a town whose name no longer appears on modern maps. The theatre was built in 1893, supposedly as a gift from a reclusive nobleman to his lover, an actress, who vanished the night before her final performance. They say her name still lingers on the dressing room mirror. But what truly unsettles visitors isn't her ghost, it's the script, bound in faded leather and labelled La Profezia di Ritorno. The prophecy of return. It tells not a story, but an unfolding. A sequence of events so specific and so outlandish, many dismissed it as the delusion of an opium-fed playwright, until parts of it started coming true. Here's your historical fact. In 1914, an anonymous tip led Italian investigators to the abandoned theatre, where they found the script open to a passage describing a war begun by the death of a man who was not meant to die. 6 days later, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Since then, the pages have been sealed in glass, but the script continues to write itself. That's right, new lines appear on blank pages in thick black ink, always during storms, always in Italian. Joke Tucker and 28. And here I thought the worst part of writing was writer's block, not haunted paper. Scholars have tried to debunk it for decades. Some argue it's a hoax, clever forgery using disappearing ink or trick paper. Others believe it's a psychological phenomenon. People see what they expect. Historians still argue whether the prophecy's accuracy is engineered through interpretation or true synchronicity, but one undeniable fact remains. Everything the script has predicted has come to pass, in order, with eerie specificity. Here's a quirky detail. One line added in 1982 reads simply, "The clown will dance in the dark where no children laugh." For years, people chalked it up to metaphor. Then came 1986, the Challenger explosion, the TV broadcast, a popular children's science show that never aired again. The prophecy continues. It tells of a final performance, one where the audience forgets they were ever watching, one where the actor on stage realizes too late he's not acting, because the prophecy's last line reads, "And when the lights dim and the silence falls, the dream will dream back." So what does that mean? According to some occult theorists, it suggests our world isn't real in the traditional sense, but a kind of performance. A beautifully scripted illusion, maintained by belief memory and narrative. If people stop believing in the story stops being real. But the reverse, if the dream does dream back, if the stage remembers you, then the lines you speak stop being your own, and you start living not a life, but a script. The prophecy warns the final dream is recursive. It folds in on itself. Time loops, people repeat phrases they never said. The end of history is not war or climate or chaos. It is the loss of narrative agency. Joke Tug 29. So basically, life becomes a badly written sequel. In 2017, a maintenance worker cleaning the abandoned theatre reported hearing music from behind the curtain. He walked on stage. The lights flared. A shadow moved, and he ran. Later, he said something strange. "I knew the notes. I just didn't know how I knew." Since then, no one has entered the building. The town around it is slowly emptying, as if forgotten not by accident, but by design. Locals say dreams have changed. People speak in sleep. Children draw spirals. And the latest prophecy line, "Soon the dreamer will open their eyes." Now imagine this, the world, as you know it begins to subtly rewrite itself. Not drastically, just edges blurring, old memories replaced with cleaner versions, a different voice in your voicemail greeting, a friend who swears you told them something you never remember saying. You begin to feel like an actor reading lines you didn't rehearse, and the final moment, a spotlight, quiet breath, and a curtain that falls not on a stage but on you. That is the last of the horrible prophecies no one ever took seriously. Not because they weren't terrifying, but because they asked the one question no one wants to answer. What if this was never real to begin with? But now it's time to let all that go. Let the heavy velvet curtain of the mind begin to close. Let the stage lights dim into gentle gold. Let the dust settle once more, soft as snowfall, on the edges of forgotten things. You've wandered far tonight through trembling sands and silent gates into pages that write themselves, and mountains that remember. Your feet have brushed against the edges of timelines, not taken your eyes, glimpsed echoes of a future that might only be metaphor. It's all right to let it blur. Breathe in slowly. Hold it for just a moment longer than usual. Let it fill you not with fear, but with that old sweet weight of wonder. The kind you felt as a child, just before sleep pulled you under. The kind that didn't need answers. You see, dreams are strange companions. They mirror you, refract you. Sometimes they forget they are dreams at all. But when morning comes, and it always does, what lingers isn't terror. It's texture, a name almost remembered, a doorway almost seen, a prophecy half whispered floating like a feather in your mind. And so tonight, as your thoughts soften and the world outside grows quiet, know this: nothing follows you out of this dream unless you invite it. You are safe. You are still. The theatre is silent now, its doors closed, the story folded neatly away. Whatever truths you heard, let them rest. Because the most powerful prophecy is this: that you're still here, still breathing, still dreaming even now. And perhaps that is all you ever needed. So sleep well, traveller of tales, and when you wake, maybe leave the curtain closed a little longer. End of script. Sweet dreams.